The debriefing room at Rechlin was sparse and functional concrete walls, a single table, harsh overhead lights that made everyone look tired. Baumbach laid out the reconnaissance photographs taken during the test. 5 impact points on the white circle, 4 within 10 meters of center, 1 direct hit. The craters were clearly visible in the aerial shots, dark wounds in the white concrete. Oberleutnant Steinmann studied the images for a long time without speaking. Finally, he looked up. "You're absolutely certain? This wasn't luck? Equipment error? Operator error?" "I'm certain." Baumbach kept his voice level, professional, but he could hear the strain underneath. "And I'm barely competent with this device. I've had 3 weeks of practice. The Americans train their bombardiers for 6 to 12 months before they're considered combat ready. Some specialists train for over a year. They live with this sight. They practice in simulators, in flight, in every weather condition. They memorize procedures until they can operate it in their sleep." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I hit the target 4 times out of 5 on my first actual bombing run. 4 out of 5. Imagine what their specialists can achieve. Bombardiers who've logged hundreds of hours with the Norden, who know its quirks and limitations, who can synchronize in minutes instead of the 15 minutes it took me at first. Imagine formation bombing, where 30 aircraft all have one of these sites, all operated by trained specialists, all dropping on the same target within seconds of each other." Steinmann was quiet, but Baumbach could see him doing the mathematics. 30 B-17 seconds, each carrying roughly 2 tons of bombs, 60 tons total. If each bombardier achieved even moderate accuracy, dropping within 50 meters of the aim point instead of kilometers away, that entire 60-ton payload would land within the area of a city block, concentrated, devastating, not scattered across neighborhoods, but focused on the actual target. The implications, Steinmann said slowly, are considerably worse than we thought. They're catastrophic. Baumbach stood up, unable to sit still any longer. For 3 years, we've been telling ourselves that American daylight bombing is ineffective, reckless, that they lose aircraft at unsustainable rates and accomplish nothing that couldn't be achieved more efficiently with night area bombing like the British. We've convinced ourselves that their precision claims are propaganda, that they're just trying to make their bombing campaign sound more moral, more civilized, less like terror bombing. He gestured at the photographs. But they're not lying. They can hit what they aim at. Not every time weather, smoke, mechanical failures, combat stress, all reduce effectiveness. But the capability exists. The potential is real. When conditions allow, when their bombardiers have time to synchronize properly, when the target is visible, they can place bombs exactly where they want them. How many of these sites do they have operational? Intelligence estimates over 2,000 currently in service. Production continues at approximately 100 to 150 per month. Every B-17 and B-24 carries one. Every American heavy bomber group has dozens of trained bombardiers. And this was the part that had kept Baumbach awake the previous night. This isn't new technology. The Norden site entered production in 1931, 12 years ago. The Americans have been refining it, training with it, perfecting its employment for over a decade. They entered the war with this capability already developed. Steinmann's face had gone pale. Then why haven't they destroyed us already? It was the obvious question. If the Americans could hit targets with this precision, why were German factories still producing? Why were rail yards still operating? Why hadn't the bombing campaign already crippled German industry? Several reasons, Baumbach said. Weather is the biggest factor. The Norden requires visual target identification. Cloud cover, smoke, haze, any visual obstruction makes it worthless. Germany has terrible weather, especially in winter. Days of clear visibility are rare. The British discovered this during their daylight bombing campaign in 1939 and 40. They couldn't find targets, couldn't bomb accurately, couldn't survive the losses. That's why they switched to night area bombing. He counted off on his fingers. Combat attrition is second. The Americans are losing bombers faster than they can train replacement crews. A bombardier needs months of training with the Norden to achieve real proficiency, but crews are being shot down after 10, 15, 20 missions. The Americans haven't yet built up a pool of truly experienced bombardiers who can maximize the site's capabilities under combat conditions. Most of their bombardiers are adequate. They can operate the site, achieve moderate accuracy, but they're not experts, not yet. Third factor, defensive measures. Our fighters attack during bomb runs, forcing evasive maneuvers that break the synchronization. Flak creates smoke and vibration that disrupts the site's stability. Even searchlights can blind the bombardier at critical moments. The Norden needs stable flight and clear visibility during the entire approach, usually 3 to 5 minutes. That's an eternity in combat. We've been disrupting their bomb runs effectively enough that they can't always utilize the site's full potential. But, and this was the critical point, the one that made everything else irrelevant, they're learning, they're adapting, their formations are getting tighter, their fighter escorts are improving, they're developing tactics to suppress flak during bomb runs, and most importantly, they're accumulating experienced crews who survive long enough to become truly proficient with the Norden. Every month, they get better at this. Every month, more of their bombs land on target instead of in fields. Steinman pulled out another folder, this one containing intelligence assessments of recent American raids. The attack on the U-boat yards at Wilhelmshaven in February. We estimated it was a failure, high casualties for the Americans, minimal damage to us. Most bombs fell in the harbour or residential areas. Because weather was marginal, Baumbach said. Partial cloud cover. The lead bombardiers couldn't get proper visual identification. Most crews dropped blind, following the leader. But some, he flipped through the folder until he found the damage assessment photographs. Some hit. Look at this building here. Direct hit. And this dry dock. Struck by multiple bombs. Not near misses. Direct hits. In conditions where conventional bombing would have achieved nothing, some American bombardiers with Norden sights still managed accuracy. Now imagine perfect conditions, clear sky, no clouds, light winds, experienced bombardiers, proper fighter escort. What happens then? Steinman didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. We need to recommend immediate strategic changes, Baumbach said. Dispersal of critical industries, underground production facilities, redundancy in manufacturing. The current model large, concentrated factory complexes in major cities is obsolete. It made sense when bombing was area bombardment, when you could hide factories in the chaos of urban sprawl. But if the Americans can pick out specific buildings, can drop bombs through their roofs from 7 kilometers up, then concentration is vulnerability. He thought about the factories he'd seen across Germany, the aircraft plants, the tank works, the ball-bearing manufacturers, all of them large, obvious, easy to identify from altitude, perfect targets for precision bombing. Schweinfurt should be evacuated immediately. The ball-bearing plants there are critical, and they're sitting in the open, easy to find, easy to hit. If the Americans ever get clear weather over Schweinfurt and send enough bombers willing to take the losses, they can destroy German ball-bearing production in a single day. The Reichsmarschall won't authorize evacuating Schweinfurt based on a single test, Steinman said. You know how this works. He'll demand more proof. He'll say you're overreacting. He'll argue that combat conditions are different from test conditions. Then people will die unnecessarily, Baumbach said flatly. American bombardiers will put bombs through the roofs of those factories, and hundreds of workers will be killed, and ball-bearing production will drop by 2/3 overnight, and the Reichsmarschall will act surprised. But it won't be a surprise. We're telling him now. We're telling him exactly what's going to happen. He picked up the Norden sight from where it sat on the table, feeling its weight in his hands. This is analog technology, mechanical computers, pre-war engineering. It represents precision manufacturing, yes, but nothing exotic, nothing we couldn't theoretically replicate. The problem is, he set it down carefully. We can't, not under wartime conditions, not with our manufacturing capacity under constant attack, not with our precision instrument makers being bombed or drafted. The tolerances required are too tight, the materials too specialized, the assembly too time-consuming. Even if we could replicate the Norden, it wouldn't matter. It's not just the site itself, it's the entire system. The B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds are designed as platforms for precision bombing. Stable, high altitude, heavy defensive armament. The American training infrastructure teaches bombardiers to use the site effectively. The maintenance system keeps thousands of these devices operating. The operational doctrine integrates them into every mission. You can't just copy the device and expect equivalent results. Steinman was making notes, preparing his report. What about countermeasures? If we can't match their capability, can we degrade it? Weather is our best defense, Bombach said. The Norden is worthless against cloud-covered targets. We could develop smoke generators for critical facilities, create artificial clouds that obscure visual aiming. That would help. Attacking during bomb runs remains effective, but we're running out of fighters and experienced pilots. The Americans have fighter escorts now, long-range Mustangs that can accompany bombers all the way to targets. Our window for disrupting bomb runs is closing. He paused, thinking. Jamming is possible but difficult. The Norden is purely mechanical, no radio, no radar, no electrical signals to jam. But it relies on visual clarity. Maybe we could develop optical countermeasures, searchlights powerful enough to blind bombardiers, reflective materials that confuse visual identification. I don't know if any of that would work, but it's worth investigating. Ultimately, though, the answer isn't countermeasures, it's strategic adaptation. Accept that large, visible targets will be destroyed if the Americans want them badly enough. Stop concentrating critical production in a few large facilities. Spread it out, hide it, go underground. Make targeting difficult. Force them to expend massive resources to hit dispersed, redundant production instead of being able to cripple entire industries with a single successful raid. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, ranging across tactics, strategy, industrial policy, and defensive measures. Steinman took pages of notes. Baumbach answered every question, demonstrated the Norden's operation repeatedly, explained the implications until he was exhausted. By the end, they had compiled a comprehensive assessment that would go directly to the highest levels of Luftwaffe command. Whether anyone would listen was another matter. Baumbach left the debriefing room as the sun was setting, painting the sky over Rechlin in shades of orange and red. He walked across the airfield to where the captured B-17 sat, still marked with its American insignia, and stood looking at it for a long time. This aircraft and the device it carried represented something more profound than just a technological advantage. They represented a fundamental difference in how America and Germany approached warfare. Germany had entered the war relying on aggression, speed, and tactical excellence. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, concentrate forces, strike hard, achieve victory before the enemy can mobilize. It had worked in Poland, in France, in the early months in Russia. German weapons were often technically superior, better tanks, better aircraft designs, better tactics, but they were produced in limited numbers, operated by elite units, dependent on individual skill and experience. The Americans had done something different. They had industrialized warfare. The B-17 wasn't technically superior to German bombers, it was just well-engineered and mass-produced by the thousands. The Norden site wasn't a wonder weapon, it was precision manufacturing applied at scale. American pilots weren't necessarily better trained than Luftwaffe pilots, but there were vastly more of them, with replacements constantly coming. When Americans lost aircraft, they built more. When they lost crews, they trained more. When equipment failed, they manufactured replacements. The Norden Bombsight was the perfect expression of this approach. Reduce bombing to a standardized procedure, create a machine that can perform the calculations, train operators to use it consistently, to produce it in quantity, and accept that some will be lost or captured because you can always make more. Take the artistry out of warfare and replace it with engineering and logistics. And it was working slowly, expensively, inefficiently by German standards, but inexorably. American bombers came in formations of hundreds. They absorbed losses that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for months, and came back the next day with replacement aircraft. Their bombardiers, even the inexperienced ones, could achieve accuracy that the best Luftwaffe crews couldn't match, not because they were better, but because they had better tools and more of them. Baumbach had spent 4 years fighting in a war that rewarded skill, experience, and tactical brilliance. Now he was confronting a different kind of war, one where industrial capacity and systematic engineering mattered more than individual excellence. It was deeply uncomfortable. It felt wrong, somehow, that a mediocre bombardier with a Norden sight could achieve better results than a brilliant one without it. It violated the warrior ethos that had defined the Luftwaffe. But it was true. He had proven it himself. 3 months later, in August of 1943, Baumbach's predictions came true in the most brutal way possible. The Americans launched a massive raid against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 2 precision strikes against ball-bearing and aircraft factories. Over 300 B-17 seconds, each carrying a Norden sight, each bombardier trained to use it. The weather was clear, the targets were visible. The bomb runs, though attacked by German fighters, achieved their objectives. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt burned. Not the city, the specific factories. Bombs fell through roofs, collapsed production buildings, destroyed machinery. Production dropped by 67% overnight. The entire German war machine, which depended on ball bearings for everything from aircraft engines to tank transmissions, shuddered. Months of desperate effort went into relocating production, scavenging bearings from captured equipment, rationing supplies to critical units. Regensburg's Messerschmitt factory suffered similar devastation. The Americans didn't destroy the town. They destroyed the assembly halls where Bf 109 fighters were built. Precision, surgical. Exactly what they had claimed they could do. The cost was horrific. 60 American bombers lost, 600 crew members killed or captured, 20% casualties. Unsustainable by any rational military calculus. But the Americans sustained it. Within weeks, replacement aircraft arrived. New crews trained up. The bomber offensive continued, and it got worse. As 1943 turned into 1944, American bombing accuracy improved. Experienced bombardiers who survived 20, 30, 40 missions accumulated the kind of proficiency with the Norden sight that made them truly dangerous. Weather tactics improved attacking during breaks in cloud cover, using Pathfinder aircraft to mark targets. Fighter escorts became standard long-range P-51 Mustangs that could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The combination of improved accuracy, better protection, and growing numbers created a bombing campaign that Germany simply could not stop. By 1944, the strategic situation had become untenable. Every clear day brought American bombers. Every raid achieved some measure of success. German industry, instead of ramping up production to meet demand, struggled to maintain output. Factories moved underground at tremendous cost. Production dispersed into smaller, less efficient facilities. Critical resources, steel, skilled workers, machinery were diverted to bomb damage repair instead of weapon production. The Norden Bombsight didn't win the air war by itself. Weather still limited its effectiveness. Germany's cloudy climate meant that precision bombing was only possible on a fraction of days. Defensive measures took their toll. Fighters, flak, and tactics continued to disrupt bomb runs and kill American crews. The Americans never achieved the surgical precision they aspired to in training. Combat was too chaotic, too violent, too unpredictable for that. But they achieved enough. They hit enough targets, destroyed enough factories, killed enough workers, and disrupted enough production to matter strategically. The German war machine, which needed to grow stronger each month to match Allied production, instead grew weaker. Not catastrophically, German industry showed remarkable resilience, adapting and surviving despite the bombing. But incrementally, steadily, the balance tilted. Baumbach, watching this unfold from his position in the Luftwaffe's Technical Evaluation Division, understood that he had witnessed the turning point in May of 1943 at Rechlin. Not the moment Germany lost the war that involved many factors beyond bombing accuracy, but the moment when it became clear that German air defenses could not prevent the systematic destruction of German industry. When the Americans proved they could hit what they aimed at, everything else was just mathematics. They had more aircraft, more crews, more bombs, more Norden sites. Eventually, they would hit everything that mattered. The great irony that haunted Baumbach, the thought that kept him awake years later, after the war, when he sat in Allied interrogation rooms answering endless questions about German technology, was that Germany had captured examples of the Norden sight as early as 1941. Luftwaffe intelligence had known about American claims of precision bombing from the beginning. Multiple opportunities had existed to test captured sites, to understand their capabilities, to recognize the strategic implications. But German leadership had dismissed the claims as propaganda. They had assumed, based on their own experience, their own technical limitations, their own understanding of what was possible, that precision bombing from high altitude was fantasy. They had looked at the Norden site and seen an over-engineered curiosity, not a strategic weapon. Even when presented with evidence, even when Baumbach's report went to the highest levels of command, the response had been inadequate. Dispersal happened too slowly. Underground factories took too long to build. By the time German leadership fully grasped the implications, it was too late. This wasn't stupidity. It was cognitive bias. When you can't do something yourself, it's natural to assume your enemy can't either. When your own technology falls short, it's comfortable to believe that everyone faces the same limitations. The Luftwaffe had tried precision bombing over Britain and failed. Therefore, precision bombing was impossible. The Americans claiming otherwise were either lying or deluded. Except they weren't. They had solved a problem that Germany had given up on. Not through some miraculous breakthrough, but through systematic engineering, massive investment, years of development, and industrial-scale production. The Norden site was 15 years in development by the time America entered the war. It represented a long-term commitment to solving a specific military problem through technology and training. Germany, by contrast, had assumed that tactical brilliance and operational excellence would compensate for technological limitations. And for a while, it had. German forces had conquered most of Europe with inferior numbers and often inferior equipment, making up the difference through superior training, better tactics, and aggressive initiative. But you couldn't bomb accurately through willpower. You couldn't wish away the mathematics of ballistic trajectories. You needed a machine that could do the calculations, and you needed to manufacture that machine in quantity, and you needed to train people to use it properly. The Americans had done all three. Germany had done none of them. By the time the disparity became obvious, the gap was too large to close. Baumbach survived the war and spent years afterward in Allied captivity, where intelligence officers interrogated him extensively about his evaluation of the Norden site. They were particularly interested in why Germany hadn't developed a similar device. His answer was consistent. Germany could have built something similar if development had started in the 1920s or early 30s. But by the time the war began, there wasn't enough time or resources. And once the bombing campaign started, there was no capacity to develop and manufacture precision instruments on the scale required. You can't design gyroscopes when your instrument factories are being bombed. You can't train bombardiers when you're desperately short of fuel. You can't invest in long-term capability development when you're losing the war right now. The Americans, protected by oceans, building their industry in places German bombers couldn't reach, had the luxury of long-term planning. They could invest a decade in perfecting the Norden site. They could build factories solely dedicated to producing precision bomb sights. They could train bombardiers for a year before sending them into combat. Strategic depth in geography, in industrial capacity, in human resources, gave them options that Germany never had. In his later interviews, Baumbach would describe the Norden Bombsight as the weapon that won the air war, though he always qualified this statement carefully. The sight alone didn't win anything. It was part of a system aircraft, crews, training, logistics, fighter escorts, targeting intelligence, repair facilities, replacement production, but it was the critical component that made precision bombing possible. Without it, American bombers would have been just another area bombing force, destroying cities but unable to systematically dismantle German industry. With it, they became a strategic weapon that Germany could not effectively counter. The sight's limitations were real and significant. Weather restricted its use to perhaps 1 day in 4 over Germany. Combat stress reduced accuracy substantially. Test range results were always better than combat results. Equipment failures were common. Many raids achieved only marginal accuracy. But marginal accuracy from high altitude was still revolutionary compared to what had come before. Hitting within 100 meters of the target instead of within 1,000 meters made all the difference. It was the difference between damaging a factory and destroying a neighborhood near the factory. American bombing killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians despite the precision technology. Many raids degenerated into area bombing when primary targets were obscured. Many bombs fell wide. The moral questions about strategic bombing, whether destroying cities from the air was justified, whether civilian deaths were acceptable in pursuit of military objectives, these applied to American bombing just as much as to German or British bombing. The Norden sight didn't make American bombing more moral. It just made it more accurate on the days when accuracy was possible. But from a purely military perspective, it worked. German industry was systematically degraded. Ball bearings became scarce. Fuel production dropped. Aircraft manufacturing struggled to meet targets despite heroic efforts. Transportation networks were disrupted. The cumulative effect, combined with the Eastern Front's massive resource drain, created an industrial crisis that Germany never fully recovered from. Baumbach's test at Rechlin in June of 1943 had revealed all of this in miniature. 5 bombs dropped on a white circle, 4 hits within 10 meters, 1 dead center, from 25,000 feet, using a device he barely understood. The implications had been obvious then. They had become undeniable by war's end. The Norden Bombsight, that mechanical computer wrapped in aluminum and glass, that device so secret that bombardiers died trying to destroy it, had proven to be exactly what the Americans claimed, a tool that could bring precision to bombing. Not perfect precision combat was too chaotic for that, but enough precision to matter, enough to change the strategic balance, enough to contribute significantly to Germany's defeat. Years later, when historians analyzed the bombing campaign, they would debate the Norden's actual effectiveness. They would point out that accuracy remained limited, that area bombing killed more people, that German production often increased despite the bombing. All true. But they would be analyzing from archives and statistics, removed from the lived experience of the moment. Baumbach, standing on the airfield at Rechlin after his test flight, holding the reconnaissance photographs showing those 5 impact craters clustered on and around the target circle, had understood something the historians would miss. It wasn't about what the Norden achieved, it was about what it made possible. The capability existed, the technology worked. American bombardiers could hit targets from altitudes where German defenses struggled to reach them. They could do it, and consistently enough to build a strategic campaign around it. They could do it in sufficient numbers to matter. That was the terrible truth he had discovered. Not that the Americans were winning, that was already becoming obvious by 1943, but that they were winning through systematic application of industrial and technological advantages that Germany could not match. The Norden site was just one example, perhaps the most dramatic one, but it exemplified a broader pattern. American equipment wasn't always superior, but there was always more of it, produced faster, replaced quicker, deployed in greater quantity. When Baumbach had lifted that Norden site from its crate in May of 1943, he had been looking for a secret, some exotic technology or clever trick that explained American confidence. What he found instead was something more disturbing: competent engineering, mass-produced to scale, integrated into an effective operational system. No magic, no wonder weapon. Just the grinding reality that in an industrial war, industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. The Americans couldn't put bombs in pickle barrels from 25,000 feet. That was propaganda, an exaggeration meant to boost morale and intimidate enemies. But they could hit a target circle 20 meters wide. They could destroy specific factory buildings instead of just general neighborhoods. They could systematically dismantle industrial capacity, one precision raid at a time. And when you're trying to run a war economy under that kind of pressure, when every clear day might bring bombs through the roof of a critical facility, the cumulative effect becomes unbearable. That was what Baumbach learned at Rechlin. Not that Germany would lose, he probably already suspected that by 1943, but how they would lose. Not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through systematic industrial attrition. Not because German soldiers or airmen or equipment were inferior, but because the systems that produced and sustained them were being methodically destroyed by an enemy who could hit what they aimed at. The Norden Bombsight didn't decide the war, but it revealed the nature of the war with perfect clarity. This was an industrial conflict, and the side with greater industrial capacity, more systematic organization, and better tools would eventually prevail regardless of tactical virtuosity or operational brilliance. For a combat pilot who had grown up believing in the primacy of skill and courage, it was a bitter lesson, but it was a true one. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.